When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
Whereas the enemy, by a sudden incursion, have succeeded in invading the capital of the nation, defended at the moment by troops less numerous than their own, and almost entirely of the militia, during their position of which, though for a single day only, they wantonly destroyed the public edifices, having no relation in their structure to operations of war, nor used at any time for military annoyance. Some of these edifices being also costly monuments of taste and of the arts, and others depositories of the public archives, not only precious to the nation as the memorials of its origin and its early transactions, but interesting to all nations as contributions to the general stock of historical instruction and political science. Now, therefore, I, James Madison, President of the United States, do issue this my proclamation, exhorting all the good people thereof to unite in their hearts and hands in giving effect to the ample means possessed for that purpose. I enjoin it on all officers, civil and military, to exert themselves in executing the duties in which they are respectively charged, on an occasion which appeals so forcibly to the proud feelings and patriotic devotion of the American people, none will forget what they owe to themselves, what they owe to their country, and the high destinies which await it. What to the glory acquired by their fathers in establishing the independence which is now to be maintained by their sons, with the augmented strength and resources with which time and heaven have blessed them. James Madison, Proclamation, 1st of September, 1814.
As we begin this episode, I'd like to invite you to turn your mind back a few months from the Treaty of Ghent and the Battle of New Orleans, the main subjects of our last couple of episodes. And I'd like to return to the charred ruins of the capital city at the beginning of September 1814, when James Madison had to figure out how to pick up the pieces and pull a shattered citizenry and government back together. Our opening quote is a selection from a proclamation Madison issued on September 1st to the nation. He knew that the citizens and the nation's leaders both needed to hear from him, and he had to start the process of healing before Congress came back for a special session that he had called prior to the invasion to begin on September 19th. Just what the House and Senate would find when they returned to the District of Columbia, or, indeed, if they would be returning to the capital that was, after all, was anyone's guess. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to Kenny Ryan from the Abridged Presidential Histories podcast for reading the intro quote for this episode. Kenny has been a supporter and friend of the podcast for years, and in addition to providing opening quotes, he's also been a guest on the Charles Lee and James Madison episodes of the Seat at the Table special series. We joke that his podcast, as the name suggests, is the antithesis of the Presidencies podcast and the deep dive I do, but that's really not the case. Kenny proves that brevity does not mean sacrificing insight, as in 60 minutes or less. He provides great knowledge about the lives and presidencies of each of the individuals who have served to date as chief executive. To supplement each president's episode, Kenny interviews authors and historians who provide perspective on certain key aspects of the president's career and legacy. I can't speak highly enough about Kenny's work, so if you just can't get enough of U.S. presidential history, and if you're listening to this, I assume you can't, be sure to check out Abridged Presidential Histories anywhere fine podcasts can be found. I'll also have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Special thanks also to our newest patron, John. John shared that he found the podcast through trying to find out more about recent guest, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, and is now working to get caught up on episodes. John's motivation to join? A desire to support this podcast financially. Between equipment, research materials, recording services, and more, the cost of producing a podcast can start to add up. So I greatly appreciate John's willingness to join team presidencies and support this labor of love. Special thanks also to our other patrons: Matthew, Ike, Jeremy, Michelle G., James, Joshua, Terrell, Allison, Alicia, Eric, Howard, Mark, Michael, Elizabeth, Michelle, and Scott for their continued support. If you would like to join these amazing folks in ensuring that, as we approach the 8th anniversary of the Presidencies podcast, we're able to not only continue, but expand upon the work that we're doing, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. All patrons get access to an ad-free feed, as well as updates on what is happening behind the scenes. Each support tier has its own rewards, and those at the $10 a month and more level are invited to a call with me once a month to talk about all things presidential history and much more. Thanks again to all of our patrons for helping to make this podcast available to all listeners for free. And after this brief message, we'll continue our journey through the Madison presidency.
We're the E to T. You're listening to an app at PC Game Pass. Want new games on day one like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle? How about living out your Sims life with EA Play? We're talking high-quality PC games all for one low monthly price. We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle available December 9th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. Okay, that's the ad. You can go back to doing whatever you were doing now.
Before he could think about facilitating the recovery of Washington, D.C. and the nation, Madison had to get his own literal house in order. The president's house was a charred husk. Since their return to the Capitol, the Madisons had been staying with Dolly's sister Anna and her husband, former Representative Richard Cutts, at the home on F Street that the Madisons had previously occupied during the Jefferson presidency. However, that would not be a suitable situation for the rest of James's presidency as a venue to host large-scale events as they had hosted at the president's house. Thus, they went in search of new lodgings and were soon offered a new home by a fervent, avowed Federalist. Though John Taylor III was no fan of Madison, he did own what remained after the invasion, quote, the largest entertaining space in the city, a 3-story structure dubbed the Octagon House. This home with its, quote, high-style federal design on 18th Street and New York Avenue was not the president's house, but it would have to do for the time being. While the Madisons would use it as their official residence where receptions and public functions would occur, it proved insufficient for an actual place for them to live. So in late August, they moved into a set of rooms at what was dubbed the 7 Buildings on the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 19th Street. The question remained, however, as to whether the government would remain in Washington. Shortly after news of the city's burning arrived at various points in the nation, cities began to send word that they would be willing to host the nation's capital, either on a temporary or permanent basis. Philadelphia was certainly a possibility, having been the nation's capital for 10 years prior to the move to the Potomac. Senator Rufus King, Federalist from New York, when he heard of the news, delayed his departure, expecting word any day from President Madison that Congress would meet at another locale. However, King also wrote around this time that, quote, I shall not be surprised if he, Madison, suffers the members to assemble at Washington and adjourn to some other place. This will save him from deciding. If he had any character, he would convene Congress at Philadelphia. But this he will be afraid to do. King had actually planned to delay his taking his seat in the Senate until early October, but after word of the invasion of Washington, he decided that he needed to be there to help right the course. Ultimately, Congress would convene in the District of Columbia at Blodgett's Hotel on the 19th. This temporary meeting place was a 3-story building described by Paul Jennings, an individual enslaved by the president, as, quote, an old shell of a house on 7th Street. During this time, it would also have to serve as the home of, quote, the Patent Office, City and General Post Office, committee rooms, and what was left of the Congressional Library. As noted by historian Weymouth Terry Jordan, quote, when the congressmen gathered in Washington in September, they were a bewildered and disillusioned lot. Confidence in the government had all but disappeared, perhaps more so than at any time in United States history. The first question that the House took up was whether they should consider moving the nation's capital. In the first vote on the matter, 79 voted in favor of considering removal, while 37, mostly from southern states as well as Pennsylvania, voted against. When word got out, the permanent residents of Washington were fearful for the future of their city. Indeed, Joseph Gales, publisher of the National Intelligencer, was aghast when he received an anonymous submission for publication in his paper calling for the removal of the capital. Rather than acquiesce, though, Gales wrote in the Intelligencer that moving the capital, quote, would be kissing the rod an enemy had wielded. It would be deserting the seat of government at the dictation of any enemy. Likewise, the Federal Republican of Georgetown chimed in that, quote, the character of the nation is implicated in maintaining this as its capital, and it would be dastardly to abandon it. This did not stop Representative Jonathan Fisk, Democrat-Republican from New York, on September 26th from introducing a resolution in the House, quote, that a committee be appointed to inquire into removing the seat of government to a place of greater security and less inconvenience than the city of Washington. At this, Gale stepped up his defense for the federal city. He published an article under the pseudonym Philo that drew out 2 important cards in the game of public opinion: nostalgia and guilt. Seriously? People were going to so quickly abandon the city that George Washington himself had guided its construction and that was named after the great general and first president, that man who had done so much and given so much for his nation? Then came the practical arguments. The federal government, in the establishment of the District of Columbia, had entered into contracts with both Maryland and Virginia to carve out the district from their lands. Those contracts would have to be voided. Likewise, folks had sold their property to the federal government under favorable terms in good faith. Philo also asked a rather pointed question, quote, if then the government begin to move, where will it stop? Our disgrace would indeed be sealed, should our enemy or should the world be suffered to believe that with a handful of men they can drive our government from its seat. It would be considered as proof of its disorganization and of the rapid progress made by the enemy towards our subjugation. It would be felt in our pending negotiations and lessen us in the estimation of all of Europe. Gales also had a couple of powerful allies in his fight for Washington, D.C., James and Dolly Madison. For his part, James did what he always did, gathered facts to make his case. He requested an assessment of the cost to clear the debris from the sites of both the U.S. Capitol and the President's House. The cost estimate came to $1,200, but the assessor went one step further. He had brought in an architect from Philadelphia who happened to be the son-in-law of Senator Samuel Smith, Democratic-Republican from Maryland, who urged, quote, the president to have the Capitol roofed in a temporary manner for the purpose of preserving the work that still remains good internally. Without a precaution of this kind, the rain and frost of the winter will, if not entirely destroy, weaken the arches or vaults that are now good. In other words, the basic structures were not a complete loss. There was a possibility of rebuilding if Congress could be brought around to the idea. Dolly Madison, meanwhile, went on the charm offensive. 2 days after Congress convened, Dolly began the 1814 social season by hosting a reception at the Octagon House, which, quote, enjoyed a record attendance. The Octagon House was not ideal. As noted by historian William Seal, quote, the Octagon's planning invited bottlenecks. The main rooms each had one door, and traffic converged in a stair hall. Dolly did what she could to recreate some of the visual effects from the president's house. At one table party, Dolly stationed enslaved individuals from the cellar to the attic with pine torches to, quote, flood the house with light in lieu of the lighting fixtures she had enjoyed. Though Dolly suffered from bouts of sadness that autumn, even to the point that she would burst into tears while having tea with friends, the First Lady, in her flight from the president's house, with Washington's portrait in tow, was already being mythologized. As noted by her biographer Catherine Algor, quote, Dolly became an active symbol of the renewed patriotism that Americans felt. Still, there was a pall in the air as long as the war continued. Though Dolly brought back her weekly Wednesday evening drawing rooms in early November, whereas no one had refused an invitation from the First Lady prior to the invasion, according to Seal, quote, now she did receive regrets. Worse, guests sometimes failed to show up. Meanwhile, the debate continued in Congress, and local leaders, including Mayor James Blake and banker John Van Ness, rallied to counter calls to move the Capitol, even on a temporary basis. Representative John Ray, Democratic-Republican from Tennessee, objected to considering the issue at all at a time that Congress should be more focused on prosecuting the war from where they were at, rather than on whether they should adjourn and meet somewhere else. Representative Thomas Grosvenor, Federalist from New York, objected to taking up the issue while there were still a number of members of Congress absent. Despite these objections, the vote was finally called. By a vote of 74 for to 83 against, the resolution to move the capital city was defeated. While prominent officials in Washington had counted on having Madison's veto as a failsafe, it was still a relief that the idea had been shut down this way, with Congress committing to remaining in the district. A couple of weeks later, the official estimate for rebuilding the government buildings destroyed in the invasion was reported to Congress: $460,000. John Van Ness and other local bankers immediately put forward an offer of a loan of $500,000 for the rebuilding effort. With the question of the Capitol settled, Madison had to turn to rebuilding his cabinet. By this point, as covered in episode 4.35, John Armstrong had resigned as Secretary of War in the wake of the scandal of his thwarting preparedness measures leading up to the British invasion of Washington. Though Madison intended Secretary of State James Monroe to only be acting Secretary of War, Monroe, who had previously indicated an interest in the position as head of the War Department, urged Madison to make it permanent in order to restore public confidence. Madison agreed and submitted his name to the Senate, which quickly agreed and confirmed the nomination. Before the month of September was up, however, the president had received 2 more resignation letters, those of William Jones as Secretary of the Navy and George W. Campbell as Secretary of the Treasury. Jones was certainly leaving the Navy in a much better position than Campbell was leaving the Treasury, which you can, of course, learn more about in their respective seated at the table episodes. But regardless, this meant Madison had 2 more positions to fill. Treasury was the easier prospect, as Madison just turned to someone he had approached about the position previously and who, after hearing rumors that Campbell was on his way out, had sent word to Monroe and Jones that he was interested in filling the post. Thus, Alexander James Dallas of Pennsylvania was soon tapped to be the next Secretary of the Treasury, and after a quick confirmation, he assumed this new post on October 13th. The Secretary of the Navy position took a bit longer to fill. Initially, Madison approached Commodore John Rogers about replacing Jones. However, Rogers did not want to give up his commission in the Navy in order to take the post, and Attorney General Richard Rush confirmed that an active military officer could not serve in a civilian government post. Thus, Madison had to consider other options. He ultimately landed on the brother of someone who had been approached by Jefferson back in the day to take charge of the Navy Department. As discussed in episode 3.27, Representative Jacob Crowninshield, Democratic-Republican from Massachusetts, had been approached in early 1805 about becoming Secretary of the Treasury, and though Crowninshield went back and forth on the idea, he ultimately declined the offer. Fast forward to December 1814, and Madison submitted the name of his brother, Benjamin Williams Crowninshield, to the Senate for confirmation, then wrote Crowninshield to tell him about the nomination. As we've seen in the past, sometimes Madison's tendency to send in the nomination before actually informing the person that they had been nominated sometimes worked, but there are also times where it caused headaches. It very nearly caused one this time, as Crowninshield was at first hesitant to accept the post while his wife was pregnant with their sixth child. But finally, on December 28, 1814, he wrote the president to tell him that he would accept the appointment. Naturally, he had to make arrangements for his wife to be cared for while he was gone, but finally, he made his way to Washington, assuming office as the 5th Secretary of the Navy on January 16, 1815. As noted by historian Frederick Lanier, quote, Crowninshield was unassuming, friendly toward the naval officers who immediately surrounded him, and a little awed by his sudden ascendancy. We'll have much more to say about both Dallas and Crowninshield in the upcoming episodes, as both would jump into their new roles feet first. For now, though, just know that Madison had a complete cabinet again shortly after 1815 began. Well, somewhat complete. With Monroe now at the War Department, Madison considered replacing him at the State Department in order to broaden his support. The president considered bringing in a Federalist, possibly Rufus King, but Monroe objected to this idea. Instead, they settled on New York Governor Daniel D. Tompkins as a possible replacement for Monroe at State, and Madison wrote to Tompkins about the proposed nomination at the end of September 1814. Tompkins, however, claimed that he felt that it was more important to see out the war as governor of New York, and thus declined the offer. A couple of years later, Tompkins shared another motivation in rejecting the nomination. Quote, one of the reasons for declining appointment to the State Department was the inadequacy of my circumstances to remove to Washington and support so large and expensive a family as mine is upon the salary of that office. Thus, the position of Secretary of State remained filled by Monroe for the time being. The cabinet reshuffle was not the only thing on Madison's mind at the end of 1814, however. Affairs in New England loomed on the horizon. As discussed in episode 4.33, discontent in New England over the war was growing. The region and its leaders had been largely opposed to the war to begin with, and as the war resulted in economic hardship and loss of life, this resentment grew. Then, in July 1814, the British invaded Eastport, a town in the Maine district of Massachusetts on Moose Island. The British and Americans had disputed for years whether Moose Island was part of New Brunswick or the Maine district, but Americans had established the town of Eastport. With the war, though, the British could now take the disputed island. However, they didn't stop there. In early September, what's been dubbed the Penobscot invasion began, where the British took the coastal port of Castine, then proceeded up the Penobscot River all the way to Bangor, which they raided. Within a few days, the British had control of all of Maine east of the Penobscot River and set about establishing an occupation infrastructure. Within a short amount of time, a third of Maine was out of American control. How could this happen, you ask? Well, remember that, at this point, the federal government was pretty much broke. The Massachusetts state government might have been able to do more, but as explained by historian Joshua Smith in his book on the impact of the War of 1812 on Maine, the Federalist-dominated government was more focused on power struggles with the federal government and defending what was known as Old Massachusetts to give too much attention to the Maine district. Indeed, when the federal government attempted to organize an expedition to retake eastern Maine from the British, the Federalist governor of Massachusetts, Caleb Strong, leaked information about the expedition to the press so that word got back to the British, and the expedition had to be called off. Still, Federalist leaders in Massachusetts were willing to use the situation in Maine to advance an idea that had been floated around for a while, a convention of New England states to discuss their grievances against the federal government. A special session of the Massachusetts state legislature had been called for the first week of October, and at this session, State Delegate John Lowe of Lyman in the Maine district put forward a resolution, quote, that Massachusetts should communicate with the other New England states and together send representatives to Washington to demand the president's resignation. While they didn't go that far, the Massachusetts General Court, as the state assembly is known, did approve a bill, quote, to call for a New England convention to discuss the war, and selected 12 delegates to attend the convention to be held in Hartford, Connecticut. While saying that the federal government had done little to nothing to provide for the defense of Massachusetts, the General Court also rejected a proposal from 3 delegates from the Maine district to put together a committee to, quote, examine the possibility of driving the British from Maine. While Federalist leaders in Massachusetts were discussing the possibility of secession, they were adding fuel to resentment that people in the Maine district had felt for years at being treated with little regard by the leaders in old Massachusetts. And leaders in Maine would hold their own meeting in December to discuss the possibility of secession from Massachusetts. Meanwhile, on December 15th, the convention began at Hartford. The delegates agreed to keep their proceedings secret, which, while it would allow them to speak frankly, as had been the case at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, given the purpose behind the convention, as the wife of one of the delegates noted, the secrecy, quote, gave more plausibility to the cry of treason. Indeed, the Madison administration was so concerned that Secretary of State and War James Monroe sent a confidential agent to Hartford to learn what he could, though the secrecy was maintained by the convention to the point that the agent could provide little new intelligence to the secretary. At the same time, the administration withdrew troops from the border with Canada and stationed them near Albany to be ready to move into New England if secession was in fact carried out. And Monroe coordinated with New York Governor Daniel D. Tompkins about getting support from that state's forces to assert federal authority in New England. Luckily, matters would not have to go to that extreme. The convention would not call for disunion, but instead sent a delegation to Washington with a list of grievances to present to the president. Madison, in turn, on January 12th, presented the report of the convention to the nation. The delegates called for constitutional amendments, quote, eliminating the 3/5 compromise on slave representation, requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress to declare war, to curb commerce, or to admit new states, denying foreign-born citizens eligibility in any federal office, limiting the president to 1 term, and prohibiting his being from the same state as his predecessor. It was clearly a sectional attack aimed squarely at the Virginia dynasty and the South in general. Rather than finding a president cowed by these demands, Madison reportedly laughed as he read the report. There was no impetus to act on this report, however, for shortly after the arrival of the convention's representatives, news of a peace treaty with Britain started filtering into the capital. Ultimately, the coming of peace made the Federalist complaints from the convention look petty and self-serving and would start a counter-movement to undo the gains that they had made in New England states when the unpopularity of the war was the main issue. Meanwhile, the administration was dealing with another person who had been a thorn in their sides for quite a while, our old friend, General James Wilkinson. As noted in episode 4.33, Wilkinson had been removed from command pending the results of the third court-martial in his long military career. On January 3, 1815, General Henry Dearborn convened the court-martial, with Martin Van Buren acting as the judge advocate as appointed by the administration to prosecute Wilkinson. However, Wilkinson quickly made the point that it was inappropriate for a civilian to be acting in a military court, and Van Buren was thrown out of the proceedings. Then, one after the other, Wilkinson defended himself against the charges that he had been brought up on, and on March 21st, Dearborn pronounced the verdict that, quote, "He, Wilkinson, is hereby honorably acquitted of all and every one of the charges and specifications against him." That's right, he got away with it again. However, with the end of the war and the Army's reorganization, there was no need to bring him back into active service. For some reason, the administration did try to find a position in the federal government for him, though they made sure it was going to be one in which, quote, "no money is handled." Rather than accept a position that he greatly needed for financial security, Wilkinson, still sulking at being forced into retirement from the military, refused any offer that came from the administration. As someone at the War Department wrote at the time, quote, "General Wilkinson has broken through all decorum and indulges the most malignant rage in every conversation. He will leave Washington next week for active mischief elsewhere." This mischief involved writing his memoirs, in which, as described by his biographer Andrew Linkletter, quote, "the theme of selfless patriotism betrayed by mean-minded politicians was apparent in its opening paragraph." His memoirs' publication in 1817 did not resolve his money issues, so Wilkinson traveled to Louisiana to set up a cotton plantation south of New Orleans. By 1822, he abandoned this endeavor and traveled to Mexico, where he attempted to gain the favor of Emperor Agustin in order to secure rights to establish a settlement in Texas. Agustin's abdication in 1823, however, meant that Wilkinson had to start all over again with a new administration. By this time, though, as noted by his biographer Linkletter, quote, "age had crept up on the general. There was a constant pain in his stomach, and though he dosed himself regularly with laudanum, the relief was short-lived and the discomfort longer." On December 28, 1815, General James Wilkinson passed away in Mexico City at the age of 68. Now, we all knew that this day was coming, but I know that a number of you, like me, have grown rather fond of following Wilkinson's misadventures. His is certainly a unique story in the annals of American history, and not for good reasons. He was truly a scoundrel, a traitor to his nation, and a travesty. However, at times in his career, he was revered as a hero of the Revolution and one of the greatest military leaders in active military service. At a time long before the substance's invention, Wilkinson seemed to be the original Teflon man with nothing sticking to him. He was politically savvy and cunning enough to stay in a position of power and authority for much longer than anyone might have imagined. The true extent and depth of his scandal remained hidden for decades after his passing, but having a clearer picture now of his life also provides us with a richer understanding of the Revolution and the early Republic and all the actors, both foreign and domestic, that influenced the shaping of the early United States. While I too will miss our periodic check-ins with Wilkinson, never fear, dear listeners, we've got plenty more scandalous characters ahead in our narrative. So what now? The nation was at peace after 2.5 long years, but there were still issues to be addressed. The nation's finances and economy were still in shambles, and there was still the matter of hostages that had been held in Algiers since the beginning of the war. Meanwhile, the administration had to process the lessons learned during the war of how the government and its military institutions could work more effectively. We'll begin to address some of these issues in our next Madison presidency episode, which I'm calling Shortest War Ever. Until then, special thanks again to Kenny Ryan of Bridge Presidential Histories for providing the intro quote for this episode. And be sure to check out Abridged Presidential Histories wherever you get your podcasts. Special thanks also to Christian of Your Podcast Pal for his audio editing work on this episode. If you'd like to enlist Christian services for your podcast, check out his services at his website, yourpodcastpal.com. Thanks to the folks at the Colonial Music Institute at George Washington's Mount Vernon, who graciously allowed us the use of clips from Hull's Victory as performed by David and Ginger Hildebrand for our intro and outro music. You can find out more about the great work that the Colonial Music Institute is doing to research and share information about early American music and dance by going to mountvernon.org and typing in Colonial Music Institute in the search field. I'll have links to all these available on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used in this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and links to much more information about all the American presidents. You can also find out how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast. Whether it's through a rating and review, or if you sign up as a patron of the podcast at patreon.com/presidencies, I cannot thank you enough for your support. Please feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions or comments at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not, it's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.